The moment my own son pointed at me and said, "Take her away," something inside me broke that could never be repaired. 3 police cruisers surrounded my farm.
You have to listen to me.
Their lights
I don't
flashing
believe
against the
this.
old red barn
I'm trying to
where
protect
my
you.
late husband and I had built
By
our
doing
life.
this?
2 officers stepped toward me,
How can I?
hands resting on their belts, while my son Daniel wouldn't even look me in the eye. Then I heard the pounding of paws. 6 retired military dogs burst from the barn and surrounded me in perfect formation. Every officer froze where they stood, and in that silent moment, I realized this wasn't the beginning of my nightmare. It was the day the truth finally came hunting everyone who had betrayed me. If this story touches something in your heart, I'd love to have you stay with me until the end. Please, like this video if you've ever believed loyalty matters more than blood. Subscribe if stories about family courage and justice speak to you. And before we continue, tell me in the comments, what would you have done if your own child had told the police to arrest you? I'd also love to know where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. My name is Grace Thompson, and before the county learned to whisper about me, before my own son stood beside 3 police cruisers and asked strangers to take me away, I had spent most of my life teaching soldiers and dogs how to trust each other. Trust sounds simple when people talk about it from the safety of a kitchen table. In the Army, trust could mean the difference between a soldier coming home or a folded flag being delivered to somebody's front porch. I enlisted when I was 21. Back then, women like me were often expected to prove themselves twice, once because we were women, and again because some people could not imagine a black woman giving orders in a military training field. I learned early not to waste energy arguing with every person who underestimated me. I let discipline speak for me. My first military working dog was a German Shepherd named Ranger. He was strong, intelligent, and stubborn enough to challenge every handler assigned to him before me. Ranger had already bitten through 2 training sleeves and dragged 1 young sergeant across half a field. The men in my unit joked that he would send me running home before lunch. I walked into his enclosure, closed the gate behind me, and sat on the ground. I did not shout. I did not reach for him. I simply waited. Ranger paced for nearly 20 minutes watching me, as if he were deciding whether I belonged there. Then he came close enough for me to feel his breath against my sleeve. I lowered my hand, and he pressed his nose against my palm. That was the beginning. Within 6 months, Ranger and I became one of the strongest training teams on the base. He taught me that loyalty could not be forced. It had to be built through patience, consistency, and courage. Over the next 30 years, I trained dogs to detect explosives, locate missing soldiers, guard military installations, and remain calm in situations that would make most people panic. I trained handlers, 2 young men and women who arrived nervous and left understanding that leadership did not mean domination. It meant responsibility. I carried that belief home with me when I married Michael Thompson. Michael was an Army mechanic with broad shoulders, gentle eyes, and a laugh that could fill an entire room. We met at Fort Stewart after he brought a transport vehicle into the maintenance bay beside the K-9 training grounds. One of my dogs stole his work glove, and Michael spent 10 minutes trying to negotiate for its return. I told him, he only gives things back to people he trusts. Michael smiled at me and said, "Then I suppose I'd better earn it." He spent the next 42 years doing exactly that. We bought our farm in rural Georgia after our first decade of marriage. It was not much in the beginning. 43 acres, an aging farmhouse, a leaning barn, and fences that needed replacing. But Michael saw possibility where other people saw work. We repaired the porch together. We planted pecan trees along the eastern field. We converted the largest section of the barn into safe kennels for retired service dogs that had nowhere else to go. Our son Daniel grew up surrounded by animals, military stories, and neighbors who treated our kitchen like a second home. As a little boy, he followed Michael everywhere. He carried toy tools in a red plastic box and pretended to repair tractors. When I trained a dog in the field, Daniel stood at the fence and copied my commands in his small, serious voice. "Stay," he would say. Then he would laugh when the dog ignored him and ran to lick his face. Those memories were part of what made his betrayal so difficult to understand. A stranger can disappoint you, and life continues. But when your own child becomes someone you no longer recognize, you begin searching your past for the moment you failed to notice the change. Michael died 3 years before the police came to my farm. It happened quickly. One week, he complained of pressure in his chest. The next, I was sitting beside a hospital bed while machines made sounds I still heard in my dreams. Michael held my hand on the final night. "Keep the farm," he whispered. I leaned closer because his voice had grown weak. "This place is yours, Grace. Don't let anybody rush you into anything." I thought he was worried about developers. Several companies had already approached us about purchasing nearby land for luxury homes and commercial warehouses. I promised him I would protect what we had built. Then he closed his eyes, and the strongest, kindest man I had ever known was gone. After the funeral, silence settled over the farmhouse. There were mornings when I poured 2 cups of coffee before remembering I only needed 1. I kept Michael's work jacket hanging by the back door for nearly a year. Sometimes I sat on the porch at sunset and spoke to him as if he were still beside me. The dogs helped me survive that loneliness. Rex, a Belgian Malinois with a scar across his shoulder, slept outside my bedroom door. Daisy, an older German shepherd, followed me from room to room. Bruno Scout Major and Willow each carried memories of handlers' deployments and lives spent in service. They were not weapons. They were veterans in their own right. Daniel began visiting more often after Michael died. At first, I was grateful. He brought groceries, repaired a broken gate, and helped me sort through insurance forms. He said I should not have to deal with paperwork while I was grieving. "Let me handle the complicated things, Mom," he told me. "That's what family is for." I trusted him. That was my first mistake. Daniel began paying several bills from my checking account, though I had never formally asked him to. Then he suggested placing his name on one account so he could help during emergencies, Ashley. His wife supported the idea. "You shouldn't be worrying about money at your age," she said. One afternoon, smiling as though she were offering comfort. "Daniel just wants to protect you." I did not like the phrase "at your age," but I ignored it. I was 67, not helpless. Still, grief had made ordinary tasks feel heavier. I allowed Daniel to assist with property taxes, farm expenses, and veterinary bills. He created online accounts and changed several passwords, promising to write everything down for me. He never did. Little by little, I stopped receiving paper statements. When I asked about them, Daniel said banks were moving everything online. When I wanted to review the farm insurance, he told me he had already handled it. When a contractor called about an inspection I had never scheduled, Daniel said it must have been a misunderstanding. Each incident seemed too small to justify an argument. That was how he gained control, not through one dramatic act, but through 100 quiet decisions I allowed because I loved him. One evening, I walked into my office and found Daniel sitting at Michael's desk. A stack of financial papers lay open in front of him. He quickly turned them face down. "What are those?" I asked. "Nothing important." "Then why hide them?" He laughed, but his face had tightened. "You're becoming suspicious of everything, Mom." The comment stayed with me. I had spent decades noticing changes in posture, breathing, eye movement, and behavior. In military dog training, details mattered. A handler who ignored small warning signs often discovered too late that a situation had become dangerous. Daniel knew that about me, yet he had begun speaking as if my instincts were evidence of confusion. That night, I checked the filing cabinet where Michael and I kept our property records. The deed was still there. So were the tax documents and insurance policies. I told myself I was imagining trouble because grief had made me fearful. But 2 weeks later, Daniel invited a man named Walter Pierce to walk across the western field. Walter represented a development company from Atlanta. Neither of them knew I was watching from the barn. Daniel pointed toward the pecan trees, the kennels, and the hill where Michael's ashes had been scattered. Then Walter handed my son a folder. Daniel opened it, smiled, and shook the man's hand. When I confronted him later, he claimed Walter was only offering advice about the property's value. "You should be thanking me," he said. "I'm trying to secure your future." My future is here. Daniel sighed as though I were a difficult child. You can't manage this place forever. I'm managing it now. For now, he replied. Those 2 words chilled me more than I wanted to admit. That evening, I stood in the barn while Rex rested his head against my leg. The sun disappeared behind the fields Michael and I had worked so hard to keep. For the first time, I allowed myself to consider a painful possibility. My son was not helping me preserve my life. He was quietly arranging a future in which I no longer controlled it. And what I did not yet understand was that Daniel had already taken far more than passwords and paperwork. He had begun taking away the people who might have believed me. For weeks after I saw Daniel walking my land with that developer, I kept telling myself there had to be another explanation. A mother has a remarkable ability to excuse the people she loves. We tell ourselves they're tired, they're stressed, they're grieving too. We search for reasons that make their behavior hurt a little less. I was no different. When Daniel called the next morning, his voice sounded cheerful, almost as if nothing unusual had happened. Morning, Mom. Need anything from town? No, I answered. You sure Ashley's already at the grocery store? I'm fine. There was a brief silence before he spoke again. About yesterday. Yes, the developer was just curious about the area. Nothing serious. I hope that's true. It is. His answer came too quickly. For someone who had spent 3 decades reading nervous handlers before dangerous missions, hesitation always meant something. So did answers that arrived too fast. I hung up with an uneasy feeling I couldn't explain. Life on the farm continued much as it always had. Every morning began before sunrise. The retired military dogs waited patiently while I filled their bowls. Rex always sat first. Major inspected the fence before eating. Scout circled twice before lying down. Daisy insisted on carrying her old rubber toy everywhere she went, though she hadn't played with it in years. People often asked whether I was afraid living alone. The truth was, I never felt alone. Those dogs had protected soldiers under enemy fire. Protecting an old woman on a quiet Georgia farm was probably the easiest assignment they'd ever received. Sometimes I laughed thinking about it. Other times I wondered if they sensed the tension building long before I did. Animals notice things people ignore. Daniel began visiting less frequently. When he did stop by, Ashley was almost always with him. She had a polished smile that never quite reached her eyes. Ashley complimented the farmhouse. She praised my flowers. She admired the dogs from a safe distance, but everything she said felt rehearsed. One Saturday afternoon, while I served iced tea on the porch, Ashley looked across the property. You know, she said casually, this land is worth a fortune now. I smiled politely. It's worth more than money. She laughed softly. That's easy to say when you already own it. Daniel shifted in his chair. Ash. What? She asked innocently. I'm only saying retirement could be easier somewhere smaller. I looked at both of them. This isn't just property. Ashley shrugged. It's still land. No. It's memories. Daniel sighed. Mom memories don't pay taxes. They've paid mine for years. You know what I mean. I do. And my answer is still no. The conversation ended there, but Ashley's expression told me something. She wasn't disappointed. She was irritated, as though my refusal had interrupted a schedule I wasn't supposed to know existed. A few days later, I stopped by Daniel's house to drop off fresh vegetables from the garden. Ashley didn't hear me come inside. She was speaking on the phone. She won't agree. Pause. I know. Another pause. We're working on that. I froze. The evaluation should make everything easier. Evaluation. My heart skipped. Ashley laughed quietly. No, she still thinks she's making her own decisions. I stepped backward before she could see me. By the time she came into the kitchen, I was placing tomatoes on the counter as though I'd just arrived. Oh, Grace, she said with exaggerated surprise. You scared me. I'm sorry. You should have knocked. I thought family didn't have to. Her smile faltered for only a second. Driving home, one sentence repeated itself inside my head. The evaluation should make everything easier. I knew exactly what that meant. A mental competency evaluation. If someone convinced a court that I could no longer manage my affairs, everything could change. The bank accounts, the farm, medical decisions, even where I lived. I wanted to believe I was imagining things, but military training had taught me one lesson I never forgot. When several strange events begin pointing in the same direction, they're rarely coincidences. The following week, Daniel invited me to dinner. I miss spending time together, he said. I almost declined. Instead, I decided to go. Maybe I needed to hear him out. Maybe this was my chance to understand what had happened to the little boy who once cried when an injured puppy scraped its paw. Dinner started pleasantly enough. Ashley cooked roast chicken. Their 2 children laughed while chasing each other through the living room. For a few minutes, everything almost felt normal. Then Daniel cleared his throat. Mom? Yes, we've been talking. I can see that. We're worried. About what? You've been forgetting things. I blinked. I have. Ashley leaned forward. You forgot Emma's piano recital. I wasn't invited. Daniel looked uncomfortable. You forgot to refill one of your prescriptions. My doctor changed it. Ashley continued anyway. You left the garden hose running. It rained that afternoon. Daniel rubbed his forehead. Mom. What? We think it might be time to consider assisted living. The room fell silent. Even the children stopped laughing. I looked at my son, really looked at him. The same brown eyes, the same crooked smile he'd inherited from Michael. But something behind those eyes had changed. When did you decide I couldn't live my own life? We're only trying to help. I didn't ask for help. You don't have to. I absolutely do. Ashley reached across the table. We're thinking about your safety. No. I think you're thinking about my farm. Daniel stood abruptly. That's not fair. Then tell me I'm wrong. Neither of them answered. I drove home with tears blurring the road. Not because they'd suggested assisted living. Some people choose it and live wonderful lives. That wasn't the issue. The pain came from realizing they had discussed my future without including me. They weren't asking. They were preparing. Preparing me. Preparing everyone around me. Preparing the story they wanted people to believe. That night, I couldn't sleep. I walked outside beneath a sky full of stars. The dogs followed quietly. Rex sat beside me on the porch. Major lay near the steps. Scout rested his head against my boot. I whispered into the darkness. Michael, I don't know what I'm missing. I know something isn't right. I just don't know how far it's gone. The only answer was the gentle breathing of 6 faithful dogs. For the first time in my life, I felt like a stranger in my own family. And deep inside, I sensed something much worse was already happening behind closed doors, something Daniel believed I would never discover. The next morning, I did something I hadn't done in years. I locked my office, not because I believed someone would break in, because for the first time I believed someone already had. Michael had always laughed at my habit of keeping every important document neatly labeled inside metal filing cabinets. If the Army ever needs someone to organize classified files, he'd tease, "They're calling you first." His joke echoed in my mind as I unlocked the top drawer. The folder labeled Property Deeds was still there. So were our tax records. At first glance, everything looked untouched, but when I lifted the stack, I noticed something strange. The folders weren't in my order. That might sound insignificant to most people. It wasn't to me. For nearly 40 years, I'd arranged every file the same way: deeds, insurance taxes, veterinary records, utility bills. I could reach for any document without looking. Now 2 folders had been switched. Someone else had opened the cabinet. someone who didn't know my system. I carefully replaced everything without saying a word. If Daniel or anyone else had been inside this room, I wasn't going to warn them that I'd noticed. Later that afternoon, I drove into town to pay the quarterly property tax in person, something Michael and I had always enjoyed doing together. Mrs. Evelyn Parker, the longtime clerk, smiled when I walked through the courthouse doors. "Grace, haven't seen you in months." "I've been paying online," I replied. She frowned. "No, dear." "What do you mean?" "The payments have been coming from someone else." My stomach tightened. "Someone else?" Mrs. Parker clicked through several screens. "They've all been submitted electronically under an authorized representative." "I never appointed one." She looked confused. "I assumed you had." I forced a smile. "There must be a mistake." "I hope so." She printed a payment history and quietly slid it across the counter. The name listed under the account administrator wasn't mine. It was Daniel Thompson. I folded the paper carefully and slipped it into my purse. I didn't confront him. Not yet. When I arrived home, Ashley's SUV was parked in my driveway. She stood beside the flower beds with a clipboard. "Oh," she said brightly, "I thought you were still in town." "What are you doing here?" "I was helping." "Helping with what?" "The landscaping." I looked around. Nothing had been touched. Then I noticed her eyes drift toward the barn. "Those dogs really take up a lot of space," she said casually. "They're retired." "I know. Have you ever considered finding them another place?" "No. They're getting older." "So am I." Ashley laughed awkwardly. "I just mean, caring for them must be expensive." "They're family. They're dogs. They've earned more respect than most people." For a brief second, her smile disappeared. Then it returned. "I was only trying to help." She climbed into her SUV and drove away. But before leaving, she glanced toward the kennel one last time. Not at the dogs, at the locks. That evening, I walked through every building on the property. The equipment shed, the old workshop, Michael's garage, the barn. Everything appeared normal until I reached the storage room beside the kennels. One shelf had been moved several inches. Only someone unfamiliar with the building would have pushed it that way. Behind it had once been an old steel lockbox. The lockbox was gone. My pulse quickened. I searched the room twice before remembering something. Michael had moved it years earlier. Only the empty space remained. Whoever searched this room had been looking for something they never found. Over the next several days, odd things kept happening. A veterinarian appointment I'd never canceled suddenly disappeared from the schedule. A prescription refill never arrived. My mailbox remained empty for 4 straight days. When I finally stopped by the post office, the clerk apologized. "We've been holding your mail." "Why?" "We received a temporary forwarding request." "I never requested one." He blinked. "It listed your son's address." For several long seconds, neither of us spoke. He quietly handed me a thick bundle of unopened envelopes. Inside were insurance notices, bank correspondence, utility statements, a letter from my attorney reminding me about updating my estate documents. Someone had tried to make sure I never saw any of them. That night, I sat alone at Michael's desk. I spread every envelope across the surface. One by one, I began comparing dates, the forwarding request, the online banking changes, the property tax authorization, the canceled appointments. Individually, each incident could have been explained away. Together, they formed a pattern. Someone was slowly separating me from every piece of information that proved I was still capable of managing my own life. It wasn't care. It was control. The next morning, I drove to Rebecca Collins's law office. Rebecca had handled Michael's estate after he passed. She greeted me warmly. "Grace, it's good to see you. I need your advice." An hour later, I told her everything. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she folded her hands. "I want to ask you one question." "Go ahead." "Have you signed anything recently that Daniel asked you to sign?" I thought carefully. "No." Anything at all. Insurance forms, medical paperwork, bank documents. I frowned. Wait. 3 months earlier, Daniel had stopped by with several papers. He'd said they were updated insurance forms. I'd signed 2 pages without reading every line because I trusted him. Rebecca's expression changed. Do you still have copies? I don't think so. Grace? Her voice became very calm. I want you to stop signing anything immediately. Do you think he's trying to gain power of attorney? I don't know. But I do know someone has been changing your financial access without your knowledge. She slid a legal pad across the desk. From today forward, write down everything. Every phone call, every visit, every missing document, every unusual conversation. If this becomes a legal matter, details will matter. I nodded. Military training had taught me the same lesson decades earlier. Documentation defeats deception. As I drove home, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. When I turned onto the gravel road leading to the farm, I noticed fresh tire tracks near the entrance. They weren't mine. They weren't from the feed delivery truck either. Someone had been there recently. Rex was already standing by the gate before I even stopped the truck. His ears were forward, his body stiff. He wasn't greeting me. He was alerting me. I followed his gaze toward the far side of the property. The gate near the western fence was slightly open. I always lock that gate, always. And in the soft Georgia mud beneath it, I saw fresh boot prints leading toward the old barn. Whatever Daniel and Ashley were planning, it had already moved beyond conversations. Someone had started searching my property. I parked my truck without taking my eyes off the open gate. Every instinct I had developed during 30 years in the Army came rushing back. When something feels wrong, don't rush toward it. Observe first. I whistled softly. Rex immediately moved to my left. Major stayed several yards ahead watching the tree line. The others remained behind me waiting for my next command. People often assume military working dogs are trained to attack. The best ones aren't. They're trained to think, to observe, to protect only when necessary. That discipline had saved countless lives overseas. Now it might save mine. I walked slowly toward the barn. The afternoon air was strangely quiet. No birds, no tractors, only the sound of boots crunching across gravel. When I stepped inside, everything appeared normal. The feed bags were stacked neatly. The tools hung exactly where I had left them. Nothing seemed out of place. Until Rex stopped. He lowered his nose to the concrete floor, sniffed carefully, then looked directly at me. Someone had been there, recently, very recently. That evening, I checked every lock on the property. The front door, the workshop, the storage shed, the kennel gates. Everything was secure again. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was waiting for me to make a mistake. I barely slept. Around 3 a.m, Daisy let out a low growl from the porch. Not barking, warning. I looked through the bedroom window. Headlights disappeared down the gravel road leading away from my farm. Whoever it was had already left before I reached the porch. The following Monday began like any other. I fed the dogs, watered the garden, started repairing a section of fencing Michael and I had planned to replace before he became ill. Around 10 o'clock, my phone rang. It was Daniel. "Morning, Mom." "Morning. How are you feeling?" "I'm fine." "You sure?" "Yes." There was a pause. "I've been thinking." "So have I. I'd like to come by later." "Why?" "I just want to check on you." "You checked on me last week." "I know. I'll stop by around 2. Before I could answer, he hung up. Not asked, told. That bothered me more than I cared to admit. Daniel arrived precisely at 2. Ashley climbed out of the passenger seat carrying a paper bag. "We brought lunch," she said with a smile. I thanked them and invited them inside. For nearly 20 minutes, everything seemed ordinary. We ate sandwiches, talked about the weather. Ashley complimented the pecan pie I'd baked. Then Daniel placed his drink on the table and folded his hands. "Mom, I already knew. Whenever he folded his hands like that, bad news followed. I've scheduled an appointment. What kind of appointment? A doctor. I'm not sick. It's just a routine evaluation. I didn't ask for one. Ashley leaned forward. We're worried about your memory. My memory is just fine. Daniel spoke gently, almost rehearsed. You've been forgetting things. No. You forgot your bank password. You changed it. His eyes widened for just a second. Only a second. But I saw it. Then he smiled again. You probably forgot I helped you. I remember perfectly. Silence settled over the kitchen. Ashley quickly interrupted. Grace, nobody is attacking you. I'm beginning to think someone is. Daniel reached into his briefcase. I brought some paperwork. I looked at the folder. What paperwork? Just temporary authorization. For what? So I can help while you get evaluated. I don't need evaluating. It'll make everything easier. The exact same sentence Ashley had spoken on the phone. Everything easier. Not safer, not better, easier. For them. I didn't even touch the papers. I'm not signing anything. Daniel sighed. Mom, no, please don't make this difficult. I think you've confused obedience with love. His face hardened. I've been trying to help you. I never asked you to take over my life. Ashley stood. We're only thinking about your future. My future was doing just fine until everyone else started planning it. Daniel gathered the papers. His smile had disappeared. I hope you reconsider. I won't. You don't understand what's happening. No, I think I understand exactly what's happening. He stared at me for several long seconds. Then he quietly said something that chilled me. We're running out of options. We, not he, we. Who exactly was we? Ashley, someone else. The developers. My lawyer's warning echoed inside my mind. Documentation defeats deception. The next afternoon, Rebecca Collins called. Grace, I need to tell you something. What happened? I checked county filings, and there was an inquiry about your property. By whom? I can't officially obtain the full request yet, but I can tell you this. It wasn't submitted in your name. I gripped the phone tighter. Was it Daniel? I can't confirm that. But someone has been requesting information consistent with transferring ownership. When? Several weeks ago. Several weeks. That meant everything had already begun long before Daniel suggested assisted living. Long before the missing mail. Long before the strange paperwork. This wasn't concern. It was a plan. 2 mornings later, while I was repairing the fence near the road, 3 unfamiliar vehicles turned into my driveway. Not police. Black SUVs, 4 men stepped out wearing business casual clothes. One introduced himself. Mrs. Thompson. Yes. I'm with Southern Horizon Development. I didn't invite you. We've been speaking with your son. I haven't? We understood your family was ready to move forward. You understood wrong. The man forced a polite smile. I'm sure we can discuss terms. There are no terms. The property isn't for sale. Another man looked toward the barn. It's an excellent location. It is. That's why it isn't leaving my family. He exchanged an uncomfortable glance with his coworkers. We apologize for the misunderstanding. As they drove away, I noticed Daniel's pickup parked almost half a mile down the road behind a line of pine trees. He'd been watching to see if I would agree, watching to see whether his plan was working. That evening, the sky turned dark with an approaching storm. The dogs became restless. Not frightened, alert. Around sunset, headlights flashed through the trees again. This time there was no attempt to hide. A sheriff's cruiser rolled slowly into my driveway, then another, and another. By the time the last vehicle stopped, 6 officers were stepping onto my property. Deputy Ethan Brooks approached the porch. His expression was serious. "Mrs. Thompson, we need to speak with you." Before I could answer, Daniel climbed out of the final vehicle. Ashley followed behind him, wiping tears from her eyes. The deputy took a slow breath. "We received reports that you've threatened your family." I looked from the officers to my son and suddenly realized exactly what Daniel meant when he said they were running out of options. They hadn't come to help me. They had come for me. For a few long seconds, nobody moved. The only sound was the soft hum of the patrol car engines and the distant rumble of thunder rolling across the Georgia sky. Deputy Ethan Brooks stood at the bottom of my porch steps with a folder tucked beneath one arm. Behind him, 5 other officers spread out across the yard, not aggressively but carefully, as though they had been told they were dealing with someone unpredictable. Then I saw Daniel. He stood with Ashley near the last patrol car, refusing to meet my eyes. I searched his face for even the smallest sign of regret. There wasn't one. "Mrs. Thompson," Deputy Brooks said, keeping his voice calm, "we'd like to ask you a few questions. I'll answer anything. We've received multiple reports expressing concern for your safety and the safety of your family." "My family's safety?" "Yes, ma'am." I looked directly at Daniel. "What exactly did you tell them?" He swallowed. "I told them the truth." "The truth?" Ashley stepped forward before he could continue. "We're worried about you, Grace. You've been confused. You've become angry. You've been making threats." I stared at her in disbelief. "I've never threatened either of you." Deputy Brooks opened the folder. "We received statements saying you threatened to use your military dogs against anyone who came onto the property." I couldn't help letting out a bitter laugh. I've spent my entire career teaching those dogs restraint. They're retired veterans. They've never attacked anyone without lawful command. One of the older officers exchanged a glance with another deputy. He seemed uncertain. Deputy Brooks continued. "Mrs. Thompson, your son also reported that you've become increasingly paranoid." Daniel finally looked at me. "I had to do something, Mom." "No, you chose to do something. They're different." I slowly stepped off the porch. Every officer instinctively adjusted their stance, not because I was acting aggressively, because they didn't know me. "I'll come down," I said calmly. "But I'd appreciate it if everyone stayed relaxed." Deputy Brooks nodded. "We're not here to escalate anything." "Good. Neither am I." As I reached the yard, Ashley suddenly clutched Daniel's arm dramatically. "See? She's doing it again. Talking like she's in charge of everything." I turned toward her. I spent 30 years leading military training operations. I know exactly how to stay calm under pressure. Ashley looked toward the deputies. She always talks about the military. It's all she has left. Those words hurt more than I expected. Not because they insulted my career, because Michael had once told me something very different. He used to smile and say, "Grace, the Army taught you discipline, but your heart is what people remember." Ashley had reduced my entire life to a symptom. Deputy Brooks glanced down at his paperwork again. "Mrs. Thompson, would you be willing to come with us voluntarily while we sort this out?" "For what? A mental health evaluation?" There it was, exactly what Rebecca Collins had warned me about. I kept my voice steady. "I've committed no crime." "No. But I haven't threatened anyone." "No. I haven't endangered anyone." "No." Then why am I the only person being questioned? No one answered immediately. Daniel broke the silence. "Mom, please? Just cooperate. So this can be over." I looked at him for a long moment. "When did you stop calling me your mother? And start treating me like your problem?" His eyes dropped to the ground. One officer quietly walked toward the barn. He wasn't threatening. He was simply trying to look around. The moment his boots crunched across the gravel near the kennel fence, Rex lifted his head. Then Major, then Scout. Not barking, watching, perfectly still. Every movement was controlled, every muscle alert. I recognized the posture instantly. Awaiting command. The younger deputies noticed too. "Sir," one whispered. "The dogs." Deputy Brooks raised a hand. "It's okay. No sudden movements." I appreciated that. He understood enough about working dogs not to panic. Ashley suddenly pointed toward the kennel. "They're dangerous. They're protecting her. They're going to attack?" I shook my head. "They haven't moved. They're standing. They're doing exactly what they were trained to do." The deputies looked again. She was right about one thing. The dogs were protecting me, but not through aggression, through discipline. Rex stood 2 yards away. Major watched the officers. Scout remained beside the porch. Daisy sat quietly behind me. Bruno and Willow held positions near the barn entrance. None of them barked. None of them growled. They simply waited. It was one of the most beautiful demonstrations of obedience I'd ever seen. Deputy Brooks slowly lowered the folder in his hands. "I've honestly never seen dogs behave like this." I smiled sadly. "They served this country. They know the difference between fear and danger." Daniel suddenly lost his patience. "For goodness sake, they're just dogs. Take her away." The words echoed across the yard. Take her away. Not, "Please help my mother." Not, "Can we figure this out?" Take her away. The officers hesitated. No one reached for me. Then something happened that none of them expected. I didn't shout. I didn't whistle loudly. I simply gave one quiet command. "Guard." It was barely above a whisper, yet every retired military dog responded instantly, like a single unit. 6 powerful dogs sprinted from the barn with astonishing speed before stopping precisely around me, not touching anyone, not lunging, not barking. Each one assumed a trained protective position they had performed hundreds of times during military service. Rex stood directly in front of me. Major covered my left. Scout moved to my right. Bruno watched the rear. Daisy remained beside my leg. Willow faced the driveway. Their eyes never left the surroundings. The entire movement lasted less than 3 seconds. Absolute precision. Absolute control. The silence that followed felt almost unreal. One deputy unconsciously took 2 steps backward. Another whispered, "My God." An older officer stared at Rex in disbelief. I know that formation. Deputy Brooks looked from the dogs to me, then back again. His expression changed completely. He wasn't looking at an elderly woman anymore. He was looking at someone he suddenly realized he didn't fully understand. No officer drew a weapon. No one reached for handcuffs. Even Daniel looked stunned. I didn't know they could do that. I met his eyes. "You never cared enough to ask." Just then, another vehicle turned into the driveway. Unlike the patrol cars, this SUV carried the county sheriff's insignia. It rolled to a stop. The driver's door opened. Sheriff Robert Hayes stepped out, removed his sunglasses, and froze the moment he saw the dogs surrounding me. Then his eyes settled on my face. A look of recognition spread across his expression. Quietly, almost to himself, he said, "Grace Thompson." Everything was about to change. Sheriff Robert Hayes didn't say another word for several seconds. He simply stood there, looking from me to the 6 retired military dogs surrounding me in flawless formation. The deputies watched him, waiting for instructions. Instead of speaking to them, he walked slowly toward me. Every movement was calm, measured, respectful. As he approached, Rex shifted his attention to me, waiting for guidance. I gave a quiet nod. "Stand easy." Immediately, every dog relaxed without breaking formation. Several deputies and I stared in amazement. One whispered, "I've never seen anything like that." Sheriff Hayes smiled faintly. "I have." He stopped a few feet away. "Mrs. Grace Thompson. It has been a long time." I searched his face. The years had added gray to his hair and lines around his eyes, but something about him felt familiar. "I'm sorry," I admitted. "Have we met?" He chuckled softly. "Not officially. But I watched you demonstrate military working dog tactics at Fort Benning almost 20 years ago." The memory returned in flashes. A large training field, military police units, explosive detection exercises, handlers from across the country. "You were there?" I asked, fresh out of military police school. "You probably don't remember me." "I remember you," he replied. "Everyone did." The yard fell silent. Daniel looked confused. Ashley folded her arms impatiently. Sheriff Hayes turned toward the deputies. "You boys know who Mrs. Thompson is?" No one answered. "She trained military working dog teams that served overseas." He pointed toward Rex. "And if I'm not mistaken, that Malinois earned a Distinguished Service Commendation after locating 3 wounded soldiers following an IED explosion." I looked at Rex. His muzzle had turned gray with age. His hearing wasn't what it used to be, but in that moment, I felt the same pride I had years ago. "Yes," I said quietly. He did. Deputy Brooks slowly lowered the folder he had been carrying. "I wasn't aware of any of this." Sheriff Hayes looked directly at him. "That's because nobody thought to ask." Daniel stepped forward. "Sheriff, none of that changes what's happening now." Hayes turned toward him. "And what exactly is happening now?" "My mother's become unstable." "Has she threatened anyone today?" "No." "Has she assaulted anyone?" "No." "Has she resisted your deputies?" "No." Hayes nodded once. "So far, all I've seen is a woman standing peacefully on her own property." Daniel hesitated. "She's manipulative." Hayes raised an eyebrow. "That's not a crime?" Ashley quickly joined in. "She's been forgetting things. She imagines people are stealing from her. She refuses medical help." The sheriff looked back at me. "Mrs. Thompson, may I ask you a few questions?" "Of course." "What day is today?" I answered immediately. He asked another. "What county are we in?" I answered again. Then another. "Who's the current governor?" No hesitation. Finally, he smiled. "You seem perfectly clear to me." Ashley crossed her arms. "That's not how dementia works." Rebecca Collins's warning echoed in my mind. They were building a story, one small accusation at a time. Sheriff Hayes looked around the property. "I'd like to hear both sides." Daniel sighed dramatically. "My mother refuses help. She talks to the dogs more than people. She thinks everyone wants her land." I couldn't help speaking. "Because someone does." Daniel laughed. "There she goes again." The sheriff didn't laugh. Instead, he asked a simple question. "Mrs. Thompson, why do you believe someone wants your property?" I took a slow breath. "Because my mail was secretly forwarded. My bank access changed. My property tax account was altered. Developers have visited without my permission. Important documents disappeared. And someone searched my barn." The deputies exchanged uneasy glances. Those weren't emotional complaints. They were specific, detailed, verifiable. Hayes noticed the same thing. He turned back to Daniel. "Do you have an explanation?" Daniel shrugged. "She's confused?" "No," Hayes replied evenly. "Confused people usually struggle with details." "Your mother remembers dates, events, and sequences remarkably well." Deputy Brooks quietly approached the sheriff. "Sir, I checked the call log." Hayes looked at him. "The complaint came from Mr. Thompson." Daniel nodded. "Yes, and 2 follow-up statements came from Mrs. Thompson." Ashley raised her hand slightly. "That was me." "No neighbors?" "No." "No independent witnesses?" "No." The sheriff's expression became more serious. "So, Today's entire welfare check is based solely on statements from immediate family. Yes, sir. Hayes looked at me again. I'd like permission to look around your property. You have it, Daniel interrupted. You don't need to do that. The sheriff turned slowly toward him. Actually, I do. As two deputies began walking toward the farmhouse, Sheriff Hayes noticed something beside the porch steps. Fresh tire tracks. He crouched beside them. Mrs. Thompson? When did these appear? This morning. You didn't make them? No. They don't match my truck. Deputy Brooks knelt beside him. They're fresh. Hayes stood. Interesting. He looked toward Daniel. Were you here today? Daniel hesitated. No. Ashley answered quickly. We've both been home all morning. The sheriff glanced at the tracks again. Then someone else visited. I said nothing. I simply watched Daniel. He wouldn't look at the sheriff anymore. A few minutes later, one of the deputies walked back from the barn carrying something in a clear evidence bag. Sir? Hayes took it. What is it? A property survey marker. I frowned. That wasn't there yesterday. The deputy nodded. It was hidden behind feed bags. Daniel suddenly spoke. That doesn't prove anything. No, Hayes agreed. But it raises questions. Ashley shifted nervously. I don't understand why we're making such a big deal out of this. The sheriff looked directly at her. Because someone appears to be preparing for a property transaction? And I'd like to know who. The atmosphere changed completely. The deputies who had arrived expecting to escort an unstable elderly woman were now quietly observing Daniel and Ashley instead. No one said it aloud, but everyone felt it. The story they had been told no longer fit the evidence in front of them. Sheriff Hayes closed the evidence bag. Then he looked at me. Mrs. Thompson, I don't believe anyone needs to be taken anywhere today. Relief washed over me, but it lasted only a moment, because Hayes continued. I do, however, believe someone has been dishonest. He turned toward Deputy Brooks. I want copies of every statement made in this complaint. Yes, sir, and contact the county property office first thing tomorrow morning. Daniel's face lost what little color remained. For the first time that day, he looked frightened. Not because I had done anything, because the investigation he planned for me had just begun turning toward him. Daniel's face stayed pale long after Sheriff Hayes gave his instructions. I had seen that look before, not on my son. On young recruits during training exercises, it was the expression people wore when they realized they had lost control of a situation they believed they had already won. Ashley recovered first. She forced a nervous laugh and crossed her arms. This is getting ridiculous. We were only trying to protect Grace. Sheriff Hayes didn't respond immediately. Instead, he handed the evidence bag containing the survey marker to Deputy Brooks. I'd like to know who placed this on Mrs. Thompson's property. Ashley shrugged. Couldn't anyone have done it? Perhaps, Hayes answered calmly. But most people don't hide survey markers behind feed bags. No one spoke. The silence was uncomfortable. The deputies began taking photographs around the barn. One measured the tire tracks near the western gate. Another photographed the disturbed shelf inside the storage room where someone had clearly been searching. I stayed out of their way. Years in the Army had taught me that investigators work best when no one tries to guide them. Truth has a habit of revealing itself when people simply observe. Rex and the other dogs remained quietly near the kennel fence. They watched every movement, but never interfered. Deputy Brooks glanced toward them more than once. I still can't believe how disciplined they are, he said. They're more disciplined than some soldiers I've known. I smiled faintly. They were never taught to impress people. They were taught to protect lives. Nearly 40 minutes passed before one of the deputies emerged from my office carrying a cardboard file box. Sir, he called to Sheriff Hayes, I think you should see this. Hayes stepped inside the farmhouse. I followed a few moments later. The deputy placed the box on my dining room table. We found it in the hall closet. I frowned. That doesn't belong there. What do you mean? Hayes asked. My file boxes have always been kept in the office. The sheriff looked at the labels. Most appeared ordinary. Farm expenses, insurance, veterinary records. Then he opened one marked property documents. His expression changed. He carefully removed several pages. Mrs. Thompson, have you seen these before? I looked closely. No. They're copies, not originals. The signatures looked familiar. Too familiar. My name appeared on several pages, authorizing changes to financial accounts and granting limited authority over property matters. I felt my stomach tighten. I never signed these. Hayes handed them to me. Are you certain? I nodded without hesitation. My signature has never looked like that. It imitates mine. But it isn't mine. Deputy Brooks leaned closer. Sir, the ink doesn't even match between the signature and the rest of the document. Hayes looked up. Good catch. Ashley immediately stepped forward. Grace must have forgotten. I turned toward her. No. I remember every legal document I've signed since Michael died. You can't know that. I absolutely can. Ashley folded her arms again. People forget. I don't. Then I looked directly at Daniel. Would you like to tell the sheriff where those papers came from? Daniel shook his head. I've never seen them. His answer came almost instantly. Too instantly. Hayes noticed. So you recognized them quickly enough to deny knowing them? Daniel blinked. I've never handled those specific documents. The sheriff quietly closed the folder. I didn't ask whether you'd handled them. I asked whether you'd seen them. Daniel said nothing. One of the deputies called from the office. Sir? We found something else. This time, it was an envelope hidden behind a filing cabinet. The deputy carefully removed a pair of gloves before handing it over. The envelope was addressed to me, still sealed. Rebecca Collins, my attorney. I stared at it. I've never received that. Hayes looked at the postmark. It was mailed almost 3 months ago. 3 months? Rebecca had warned me about updating my estate documents around that same time. Someone had intercepted the letter before I ever saw it. The sheriff carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a copy of a legal notice requesting my review of several suspicious changes involving property records. Rebecca had tried to warn me. I simply never received the warning. Hayes slowly exhaled. This concerns me. Deputy Brooks nodded. It concerns me too. The sheriff turned toward Daniel. Did you collect your mother's mail? Sometimes. Did you ever redirect it? No. Ashley quickly answered. We only helped organize things. The sheriff looked back at the unopened envelope. It appears someone organized this directly behind a filing cabinet. No one laughed. Just then, Deputy Brooks received a phone call. He stepped outside before returning several minutes later. Sir? I contacted the county property office. Hayes looked up. And? The clerk confirmed there have been multiple recent requests regarding ownership records for this property. Daniel shifted uneasily. Brooks continued. One request included preliminary transfer paperwork. My heart began pounding. Hayes asked the obvious question. Who submitted it? Brooks hesitated. The clerk couldn't officially release names over the phone. But she did confirm the requests did not come from Mrs. Thompson. The room became very quiet. Sheriff Hayes looked directly at Daniel. I'd like you to answer carefully. Have you discussed transferring this property with anyone? Daniel hesitated. Yes or no? I spoke with developers. So that's a yes. But only because... Hayes raised a hand. One question at a time. Daniel swallowed. I was exploring options. For yourself. For my mother. I finally spoke. I never authorized you to explore anything. Daniel looked at me. You were never going to agree. Exactly. The words slipped out before he realized what he'd admitted. Everyone heard them. Even Ashley closed her eyes for a brief moment. Sheriff Hayes repeated quietly, I was never going to agree. Then he looked back at Daniel. So you knew your mother opposed selling the farm. Daniel remained silent. Deputy Brooks carefully placed the disputed documents into evidence bags. The forged signatures, the intercepted letter, the property paperwork, the hidden survey marker. Piece by piece, the picture became clearer. Not complete, but clearer. The deputies who had arrived expecting to escort an unstable elderly woman now found themselves documenting possible fraud. Hayes closed his notebook. I'm not making any arrests today. Daniel let out a breath of relief. But, the sheriff continued, this investigation is no longer about a welfare check. It's now about whether someone attempted to obtain this property through deception. Daniel's shoulders stiffened. Ashley looked ready to speak, but thought better of it. Neither of them realized something even more damaging was waiting to be discovered. Because while the deputies were cataloging documents inside my office, I suddenly remembered something Michael had told me only weeks before he died. A sentence I hadn't thought about in 3 years. Grace, if anyone ever starts asking questions about this farm, don't trust the filing cabinet. I froze. The filing cabinet. Michael hadn't trusted it, which meant the real answer wasn't inside my office at all. It was hidden somewhere else. Michael's words echoed so clearly in my mind that I could almost hear his voice. Grace, if anyone ever starts asking questions about this farm, don't trust the filing cabinet. I hadn't thought about that conversation in 3 years. At the time, I'd assumed he was talking about organizing paperwork. Michael had always joked that I treated file folders like priceless treasures. Now I realized he had been trying to tell me something far more important. The filing cabinet was never meant to hold the documents that truly mattered. I closed my eyes. There had been another sentence, another memory. If anything ever happens to me, you'll remember the old workshop. My heart skipped. The workshop. Not the office, not the farmhouse. The old workshop where Michael had spent countless evenings restoring tractors and repairing Army surplus equipment after we retired. I looked toward Sheriff Hayes. I think I know where we need to look. The sheriff studied my face for a moment. What did you remember? My husband. He hid important things. Hayes nodded. Show me. Daniel immediately stepped forward. Mom, you're confused. I ignored him. Ashley tried another approach. Grace, you've been through a very emotional afternoon. No. I've finally started remembering. Without another word, I walked toward the detached workshop behind the barn. Sheriff Hayes followed. Deputy Brooks came with us, carrying an evidence bag. The other deputies remained near Daniel and Ashley. I noticed Daniel watching us with growing uneasiness. He wasn't curious. He looked frightened. That alone told me I was heading in the right direction. The workshop smelled exactly as it always had. Motor oil, fresh-cut wood, old leather. Even after 3 years, Michael's workbench remained almost untouched. His favorite wrench still hung from the pegboard. A faded army cap rested on the top shelf. For a moment, grief threatened to overwhelm me. I reached out and brushed my fingers across the worn wooden bench. I miss you every day, I whispered. Sheriff Hayes respectfully looked away. He understood. Some memories deserved silence. I walked slowly toward the far corner of the workshop. There stood Michael's old tool cabinet, heavy, steel, covered in scratches from decades of use. Deputy Brooks looked around. You think it's inside? Beneath it sat a small steel lockbox, untouched, covered in dust. Exactly where Michael had left it. Deputy Brooks let out a quiet breath. Sheriff Hayes looked at me. Do you have the key? I smiled sadly. I've had it all along. The key wasn't hidden. It never had been. Michael had attached it to an old brass keychain shaped like a horseshoe. It hung inside our bedroom closet, beside dozens of ordinary spare keys. Anyone searching for a secret key would have overlooked it completely. I unlocked the box. The metal lid creaked open. Inside lay several neatly sealed envelopes, a leather folder, a flash drive, and one handwritten letter. My name appeared across the front. Grace. Not Mrs. Thompson, not my wife, just Grace, the way Michael always wrote it. I picked up the letter first. For a long moment, I couldn't bring myself to open it. Sheriff Hayes quietly stepped back, giving me privacy. Finally, I unfolded the pages. My dearest Grace, if you're reading this, it means something has happened that I prayed never would. I know you. You'll trust more people because your heart is bigger than your fear. That's one of the reasons I fell in love with you. Tears blurred the words. I wiped my eyes and continued. But love sometimes blinds good people, especially when family is involved. My hands began shaking. If anyone pressures you to sell this farm, if anyone tells you you're no longer capable, if anyone tries to separate you from this land, open every envelope in this box before believing a single word they say. I stopped reading. How could he have known? Sheriff Hayes quietly asked, Mrs. Thompson, are you all right? I nodded through tears. He knew. He actually knew this might happen. Inside the leather folder were the original property deed, the original survey, every legal document connected to the farm, each one notarized, each one perfectly preserved. Attorney Rebecca Collins had been right. These originals carried legal authority. No copies, no altered versions, no forged paperwork. Only the truth. Deputy Brooks carefully compared one of the original signatures with the documents found inside my office. They're completely different. Sheriff Hayes nodded. The forgery is obvious once you see the original. Then I picked up the flash drive. A label read, Property Records, Backup. Hayes looked intrigued. May we examine it? Of course. Deputy Brooks retrieved a laptop from his patrol vehicle. Within minutes, the files appeared on the screen. Scanned copies of every deed, bank authorization, insurance policy, tax payment, estate document. Everything had been digitally archived. Michael had created backups years earlier. Then another folder appeared. Personal notes inside were scanned journal entries. One entry immediately caught my attention. Its date was 6 months before Michael died. I opened it. Daniel has asked about transferring the farm 3 times this month. He says it's only for convenience. I hope I'm wrong. But if anything ever happens to me, Grace must never feel pressured into signing anything. I've moved the originals. Rebecca knows where they are if Grace ever forgets. I felt the room spinning. Michael hadn't distrusted me. He had been worried about someone else, someone he loved, someone he desperately hoped would never betray us. Our own son. Sheriff Hayes slowly removed his glasses. I've investigated property fraud before, but I've never seen someone prepare this carefully. He loved her, Deputy Brooks said quietly. No. Hayes corrected him. He protected her. I looked down at Michael's letter. Even after death, he was still keeping his promise. As we carefully packed the documents into evidence bags, Deputy Brooks' phone rang again. He answered, listened, then looked toward the sheriff. Sir? What is it? I finally reached the county property records office. And? They identified who submitted the transfer inquiries. The room fell silent. Brooks swallowed. It was Daniel Thompson. No one spoke, not even me, because somehow, hearing the truth out loud hurt even more than suspecting it. And what none of us knew yet was that the investigation into those property requests was about to uncover something far worse than forged signatures. It would expose months of planning that had begun while Michael was still alive. For a long moment, The only sound inside the workshop was the ticking of Michael's old wall clock. Deputy Brooks lowered his phone slowly. "No mistake?" Sheriff Hayes asked. "No, sir." The county clerk confirmed the requests were submitted under Daniel Thompson's name. She also said there were multiple visits over the past several months. Several months. Not weeks. Months? I sat down on Michael's old wooden stool because my knees suddenly felt weak. The realization settled over me like a heavy winter blanket. This hadn't been a desperate decision made after financial trouble. It had been carefully planned, patiently built, one step at a time. Sheriff Hayes crouched beside me. "Mrs. Thompson?" "I'm all right." "No," I admitted after a moment. "I'm not. I keep asking myself the same question." "What question?" "At what point did my son stop seeing me as his mother and start seeing me as an obstacle?" The sheriff didn't answer. There was no answer that could soften a truth like that. By the time we walked back toward the farmhouse, the sky had turned dark with approaching rain. Daniel and Ashley were still standing near the patrol cars. Daniel looked at the evidence bags in Deputy Brooks's hands. His confidence disappeared instantly. "What is all that?" Sheriff Hayes stopped several feet away. "Original property records." Daniel forced a smile. "That's great. It'll clear everything up." Hayes looked directly at him. "I believe it already has." Daniel's smile faded. "What does that mean?" "It means the original documents don't match the copies found inside your mother's house." Daniel glanced toward Ashley for only a fraction of a second. "But I saw it." "So did the sheriff." Ashley stepped forward before Daniel could speak. "This is ridiculous." "Someone could have planted those papers," Deputy Brooks replied calmly. "Inside Mrs. Thompson's own office." Ashley hesitated. I don't know." Sheriff Hayes folded his arms. "Neither do we. That's why we're investigating." Daniel tried to regain control of the conversation. "Sheriff, surely you don't think I'd steal from my own mother?" "No," Hayes answered evenly. "I don't think anything. I follow evidence. And right now, the evidence is asking difficult questions." The sheriff asked everyone to gather inside the living room. Rain began falling outside, tapping softly against the windows. The dogs remained on the covered porch, lying quietly near the entrance. Even they seemed to sense something important was happening. Deputy Brooks placed the evidence bags on the coffee table. Original deeds, forged paperwork, Michael's handwritten letter, the hidden survey marker, the unopened letter from Rebecca Collins. Every item represented another crack in Daniel's carefully constructed story. Hayes opened his notebook. "I'd like everyone to answer a few questions." No one objected, at least not out loud. He started with me. "Mrs. Thompson, when was the last time you personally authorized changes to your property records?" "Never." "Did you authorize your son to negotiate with developers?" "No." "Did you authorize anyone to redirect your mail?" "No." "Did you sign these documents?" He held up one of the forged forms. "No." My answers were immediate, simple, consistent. Then he turned to Daniel. "Mr. Thompson, did you visit the county property office?" Daniel nodded cautiously. "Yes." "Why?" "I was gathering information." "For whom?" "My mother." I looked at him. "I never asked you to." Daniel ignored me. "I was trying to understand our options." "Our—" He hesitated. "My mother's options." Sheriff Hayes made another note. "Were you aware your mother opposed selling the property?" Daniel looked down. "Yes." "So why continue speaking with developers?" Daniel rubbed the back of his neck. "They kept calling." "Did you ever tell them to stop?" No answer. Hayes repeated the question. "Mr. Thompson?" "No." Ashley was next. "Mrs. Thompson?" She visibly disliked being called by her married name. "When did you first meet representatives from Southern Horizon Development?" Ashley blinked. "I don't remember." Deputy Brooks quietly spoke. They told us today you've been present during at least 2 meetings. Ashley's eyes widened. They said that, yes, they must be mistaken. Hayes remained calm. Would phone records refresh your memory? Ashley didn't answer. Just then, another deputy entered the room, carrying a small cardboard box. Sir, we found this in the back seat of Mr. Thompson's truck. Daniel immediately stood. That's my private property. The deputy placed the box on the table. It was in plain view. Hayes carefully opened it. Inside were neatly rolled architectural drawings, site plans, road layouts, utility maps. At the very top lay a large survey of my farm. Colored markings divided my property into future housing lots. My breath caught. Someone had already planned neighborhoods, driveways, streets, on land I had never agreed to sell. Hayes slowly unrolled the largest blueprint across my dining table. Every field Michael and I had planted, every fence we had repaired, every kennel, even the hill where Michael's ashes rested. Everything had been divided into numbered parcels. Daniel stared at the plans in silence. Ashley looked as though she might faint. The sheriff finally spoke. Mr. Thompson, when exactly did you commission these? They're only preliminary. I didn't ask what stage they were. I asked when. Daniel swallowed hard. They're not finalized. Hayes looked up. Neither is your answer. Deputy Brooks carefully examined the corner of one blueprint. Sir, what? There's a date. Hayes leaned closer. So, there is. The room became silent. The plans had been drafted. 11 months earlier. I closed my eyes. Michael had died 10 months earlier. The blueprints had been commissioned. Before my husband passed away. Long before. A painful realization struck me. While Michael was fighting for his life, someone had already been planning what to do with the farm after he was gone. Daniel noticed where everyone was looking. His shoulders slumped. It isn't what you think. I looked at him. Then tell me. When your father got sick, I was scared. I knew maintaining the farm would become impossible. So you decided to sell it before he even died. No, I was preparing. For what? The future. I shook my head slowly. No. You were preparing for your future, not ours. Ashley suddenly burst into tears, real tears this time, not the carefully controlled crying she'd shown the deputies earlier. She looked at Daniel. You told me she knew. Daniel stared back at her. I thought she did. No, you didn't, Ashley whispered. You said Michael had already agreed. The room froze. Every deputy looked toward Daniel. Even Sheriff Hayes stopped writing. I felt my heart pounding. Michael had agreed no. That wasn't possible, because Michael had left me a letter saying exactly the opposite. Daniel realized what Ashley had just revealed. His face turned white. He reached toward her. Ashley. But it was too late. One sentence had shattered months of lies. And for the first time since the police arrived, my son looked like a man who finally understood that the truth was no longer something he could control. No one in the living room spoke for several long seconds. Ashley's words lingered in the air. You said Michael had already agreed. Daniel looked as though the floor had disappeared beneath him. He reached for Ashley's arm. Stop talking. She pulled away. No. You told me your father wanted to sell. You said he didn't want Grace struggling with the farm. You told me everything was already settled. Daniel's voice hardened. This isn't helping. Ashley laughed bitterly through her tears. Helping? You've been saying that word for months. You said we were helping your mother. You said we were protecting her. She looked around the room before finally meeting my eyes. I'm sorry. It wasn't a dramatic apology. It wasn't enough to erase what had happened. But it was the first honest thing I'd heard from her all afternoon. Sheriff Hayes quietly closed his notebook. Mr. Thompson, I think it's time you stopped worrying about appearances. I think it's time you started worrying about the truth. Daniel rubbed both hands across his face. I never wanted any of this. I couldn't stop myself. Then when did you want it? He looked at me exhausted. After Dad got sick. The words hit me like a punch. When the doctors told us his heart wasn't getting better, I panicked. You panicked? Yes. I started looking at the bills, the taxes, the equipment, the repairs. I thought, his voice broke. I thought everything was going to fall apart. I listened without interrupting, not because I agreed with him, because I needed to hear every word. Daniel took a slow breath. I met with a financial advisor. He said the land was worth millions. He said people our age hold on to property because of emotions. He told me wealth shouldn't stay buried in dirt. I looked around the room. Did he also tell you to bury your mother? Daniel's eyes filled with tears. No. I never wanted to hurt you. But you did. I know. You lied. I know. You convinced people I was losing my mind. His shoulders slumped. I know. For the first time all day, he wasn't defending himself. He was admitting the damage. Sheriff Hayes interrupted gently. Mr. Thompson, did your father ever authorize the sale of this property? Daniel hesitated. No. Did he ever sign documents allowing you to negotiate on his behalf? No. Then why did your wife believe he had? Daniel closed his eyes. Because he couldn't finish. Hayes waited patiently. Because I told her he would have wanted it. There it was. Not a forged signature, not another document, the beginning of the lie itself. Daniel had slowly rewritten Michael's wishes until he convinced himself they were true. Deputy Brooks opened Michael's handwritten letter again. With your permission, Mrs. Thompson? I nodded. He read one paragraph aloud. Grace, if anyone ever tells you I wanted this farm sold after I'm gone, don't believe them. This land isn't valuable because of what someone will pay for it. It's valuable because it's where we built our family. The room fell silent again. Daniel lowered his head. He knew there was no arguing with his father's own handwriting. Sheriff Hayes stood. Based on everything we've gathered today, I have enough evidence to request a formal investigation into possible document fraud and attempted unlawful property transfer. Daniel looked up quickly. Am I under arrest? Not today. But this investigation isn't over. He turned toward Deputy Brooks. I want certified copies made of every document. Yes, sir. I also want subpoenas prepared for county property records, banking authorization changes, and communication with Southern Horizon Development. Daniel swallowed hard. Everything he had tried to keep hidden was about to become official evidence. Rebecca Collins arrived less than 30 minutes later. One of the deputies had contacted her after discovering Michael's letter. She stepped into the living room, carrying a leather briefcase. Grace, she hugged me gently. I'm sorry it reached this point. So am I. Rebecca greeted Sheriff Hayes before examining the original deed herself. A small smile crossed her face. I was hoping Michael's precaution would never become necessary. Hayes looked at her. You knew about this. I knew the originals existed. I didn't know where. Michael insisted that even I shouldn't know the exact location. He said if too many people knew, it wouldn't truly be protected. She looked at me with sadness. He trusted you to remember. I almost didn't. Rebecca smiled softly. But you did. Over the next hour, Rebecca explained what the documents meant. The original deed is clear. Grace Thompson is the sole legal owner following Michael's death. No transfer can occur without her informed voluntary signature. She held up one of the forged documents. And these are legally worthless. I felt an enormous weight lift from my shoulders. For weeks, I'd feared I had somehow lost everything without realizing it. Now I knew something important. My rights had never disappeared. Someone had only hoped I would believe they had. As evening settled over the farm, the deputies began packing their equipment. Rain had stopped. Golden sunlight broke through the clouds, shining across the kennels. The dogs stretched lazily, sensing the tension beginning to fade. Sheriff Hayes walked with me to the porch. "Mrs. Thompson, I owe you an apology." "You don't owe me anything. We responded to a complaint, believing you might be a danger. And instead," he smiled, "we found someone who'd spent a lifetime protecting others." I looked toward Rex, lying peacefully beneath the oak tree. I suppose old habits never leave. No, they don't. Before leaving, Hayes handed me his business card. "If anything unusual happens, you call me directly. No dispatch. No waiting. Directly." I accepted the card. "Thank you." He glanced toward Daniel, who sat alone on the porch steps staring at the ground. "I don't know what the investigation will ultimately uncover. But I do know this." He looked back at me. "Today, your husband's planning protected you. And your own integrity finished what he started." As the last patrol car disappeared down the gravel road, I stood quietly beside my retired military dogs. The farm was peaceful again, but deep inside, I knew the hardest part still lay ahead. Because exposing fraud in court would be easier than deciding whether I could ever forgive my own son. The morning after the deputies left the farm felt quieter than it had in years. Not peaceful, just quiet. There is a difference. Peace comes when your heart is settled. Silence comes when it has been broken. I carried my coffee onto the front porch before sunrise, just as Michael and I had done almost every morning for decades. Rex settled at my feet, while Daisy stretched out beside the old rocking chair Michael had built with his own hands. For the first time since the police had driven onto my property, I allowed myself to cry. Not because I had won, because I had finally accepted that I had lost something far more valuable than land. I had lost the son I thought I knew. Over the next week, life became a blur of meetings and paperwork. Rebecca Collins helped me freeze every account Daniel had access to. The bank restored my online credentials after verifying my identity. The post office officially canceled the forwarding request. The county recorder placed a fraud alert on my property title. Everywhere I went, people treated me differently. Not because they pitied me, because they had heard what happened. Mrs. Evelyn Parker from the courthouse hugged me before I could even speak. "I'm sorry, Grace. I should have called you the first time those account changes came through." "You had no reason to suspect anything," I replied. "But I appreciate you saying that." At the feed store, old neighbors who had barely spoken to me in months suddenly stopped to shake my hand. One man removed his cap. "We believed the rumors." "We shouldn't have," I smiled politely. "I don't need apologies. I just hope next time you'll ask questions before believing gossip." He nodded without arguing. Daniel didn't call. Ashley didn't either. Their silence told me more than any explanation could. Then, 9 days after the sheriff's visit, Rebecca phoned. "They've scheduled mediation." Mediation? The district attorney believes there may still be room for a civil resolution before additional criminal charges are considered. "I'll be there. So will Daniel." I closed my eyes. I had imagined this conversation 100 different ways. None of them felt real until that moment. The mediation took place in a modest conference room inside the county courthouse. There were no jurors, no television cameras, just a long oak table. Rebecca sat beside me. Daniel arrived alone. Ashley was nowhere to be seen. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. He looked older, not physically. Emotionally, dark circles framed his eyes. His shoulders slumped beneath a wrinkled blue shirt that looked as though he had slept in it. The confident businessman who had once walked developers across my land had disappeared. In his place sat a tired little boy who had spent too many nights losing arguments with his own conscience. The mediator introduced herself, explained the process, then asked a simple question. "Mr. Thompson, would you like to begin?" Daniel nodded slowly. He didn't look at the mediator. He looked at me. "I'm sorry." Those 2 words should have brought relief. Instead, they brought sadness, because they arrived months too late. "I know saying that doesn't fix anything," he continued. "It doesn't?" I answered gently. "I know." Silence settled between us again. Then he surprised me. "I haven't slept since that day." "The day the police came?" I keep hearing myself say. He swallowed hard. "Take her away." His voice cracked. I don't recognize the man who said those words. I stared at him. I didn't recognize him either. Daniel wiped his eyes. I've spent the last week asking myself how I became that person. "No one becomes someone else overnight," I said quietly. "It happens one decision at a time." He nodded. "You're right. I told myself I was protecting you. Then I told myself selling the farm would help everyone. Then I convinced myself Dad would have agreed." He looked down at his hands. "Eventually, I started believing my own lies." The room remained silent. No one interrupted, because there was nothing to interrupt. Truth doesn't need defending. "I owe you something," Daniel said. He reached into his briefcase and placed a thick envelope on the table. "What is it?" "Every document, every email, every contract, every conversation I had with Southern Horizon." Rebecca immediately opened the envelope. Inside were printed emails, financial projections, developer contracts, and handwritten notes. "Everything." Daniel looked at me. "I'm done hiding. If investigators need them, they have my permission." Rebecca glanced through several pages before looking at me. "This will help." Daniel gave a weak smile. "It should. I created the mess. I should help clean it up." I studied my son's face. For the first time in months, there was no calculation, no rehearsed explanation, no attempt to manipulate the room. Only shame. Real shame. "I need to ask you something," I said. He nodded. "When did greed become more important than family?" Daniel didn't answer immediately. Finally, he whispered, "The day I stopped seeing the farm as our home and started seeing it as a number." His honesty hurt, but it also answered the question I'd carried in my heart since Michael died. "I blamed Dad," Daniel admitted. "I thought he loved the farm more than us." I shook my head. "No. He loved the farm because it held us." He wasn't protecting dirt. He was protecting memories. Daniel covered his face with both hands. "I understand that now. I wish I had understood sooner." "So do I." The mediator quietly stepped out, giving us privacy. Rebecca remained silent. She understood that this conversation was no longer about legal documents. It was about 2 people trying to decide whether a broken relationship could survive. Daniel looked at me again. "I don't expect forgiveness." "You shouldn't." He struggled to finish. "I wanted you to know. I never stopped loving you." Tears filled my eyes. "I believe you." His expression changed with surprise. "You do?" "Yes. I believe you loved me. But love without integrity becomes something dangerous. You loved me and still chose to betray me." He lowered his head. "I know." I reached across the table, not to erase what had happened, but to make one thing clear. "I forgive you." Daniel looked up instantly. "You do?" "I forgive you because carrying hatred would only poison the years I have left." I paused. "But forgiveness isn't the same as trust." His shoulders fell. "I understand. It will take years to rebuild what was broken. If it can ever be rebuilt." "I know. And there will still be consequences." "There should be." For the first time that day, I believed he truly meant it. not because he wanted something, but because he had finally accepted that actions carry a price. As we stood to leave, Daniel hesitated beside the conference room door. "Mom." "Yes." "I drove past the farm yesterday." I waited. I saw Rex sleeping under Dad's oak tree. A faint smile crossed my face. "That's his favorite spot." Daniel nodded. I realized something. "What?" "He never left you." "The dogs?" "They stayed." His voice trembled, and I was the one who walked away. I didn't answer, because there was nothing left to say. Some lessons can only be learned after everything else has been lost. As I stepped outside into the warm Georgia afternoon, I felt the sun on my face and Michael's words in my heart. Home had never been measured by acres. It had always been measured by loyalty, and that was something no one could ever steal from me again. The legal process continued for several more months, but my heart no longer lived inside the courthouse. It lived back on the farm. Every morning I woke up before sunrise, brewed a pot of coffee, and walked the property with Rex Major Scout, Daisy Bruno, and Willow trailing behind me. The same land that had nearly torn my family apart slowly began reminding me why Michael had fought so hard to protect it. One chilly October morning, I stopped beneath the old oak tree where Michael's ashes had been scattered. The grass had begun turning golden. A gentle breeze carried the scent of pine and fresh hay. "I kept my promise," I whispered. "I didn't let them take it." For the first time in months, I didn't cry afterward. Instead, I smiled. Not because everything had been repaired, because I finally believed it could be. Rebecca Collins visited later that afternoon, carrying a thick folder. "The district attorney has decided how to proceed." I invited her onto the porch. "What happens now?" She sat beside me before answering. "The criminal investigation confirmed attempted fraud, forged documents, and unauthorized property actions." I looked toward the pasture. "And Daniel?" They considered several factors. His cooperation, his voluntary disclosure of evidence, his lack of prior criminal history. "And your wishes?" "My wishes?" Rebecca nodded. "You made it very clear you weren't seeking revenge." I remembered exactly what I had told the investigators. "I want accountability." "Not destruction." Rebecca smiled gently. They listened. Daniel would face significant financial penalties, mandatory restitution probation, and permanent restrictions preventing him from acting on my behalf in any legal or financial matter. He would live with the consequences. But he wouldn't lose his future completely. I believed Michael would have wanted that. Justice should correct people whenever possible, not simply break them. That same week, something unexpected happened. Sheriff Robert Hayes returned to the farm. This time, he wasn't wearing the serious expression I'd seen the day the patrol cars arrived. Instead, he carried a folder and 2 cups of coffee. "I figured yours might already be cold." I laughed. "You figured correctly." We sat on the porch while the dogs rested nearby. "I've been thinking," he said. "That's usually dangerous." He grinned. "My wife says the same thing." Then his expression became thoughtful. "Do you know how many retired military working dogs there are in Georgia without permanent homes?" "I've never counted." "Too many." I nodded slowly. "I know. Many handlers age. Some families can't care for them. Others don't understand what those dogs have been through." Hayes leaned back in his chair. "I visited a veterans rehabilitation center last month. They've been looking for trained therapy dogs." I looked toward Rex. "You think retired military dogs could help?" "I think they already have." He smiled. "They helped save you. Maybe now they can help save someone else." Those words stayed with me long after he drove away. That evening, I unlocked Michael's workshop again. I spread old photographs across the workbench. Pictures from army bases, graduation ceremonies, training fields, dogs standing proudly beside young soldiers. One photograph caught my attention. Michael stood beside me, one arm around my shoulders. Behind us was a handmade wooden sign, "Loyalty never retires." I'd forgotten about that sign. Michael had built it years earlier. I smiled. "No," I whispered. "It doesn't." That's when the idea finally became clear. The farm didn't need to become smaller. It needed to become bigger, not in size, in purpose. The next morning I called Rebecca. "I want to establish a nonprofit." She laughed softly. I wondered how long it would take. "You already guessed. I've known you for years, Grace. You don't spend your life protecting others just to retire quietly." Within days, we began the paperwork. The Thompson Veterans and K-9 Sanctuary would become a place where retired military working dogs and struggling veterans could heal together. Part of the barn would be renovated into expanded kennels. The old equipment shed would become a meeting space. Michael's workshop would remain exactly as he left it, a place where veterans could repair equipment, build furniture, or simply sit in silence when words became too heavy. Word spread through the community much faster than I expected. The local newspaper published a small story. Then a regional television station called. I declined interviews. I hadn't built the sanctuary for attention, but I welcomed volunteers. The first to arrive was a young Marine veteran named Chris. He carried invisible wounds far heavier than the backpack slung over his shoulder. "I heard you might need help fixing fences," he said. "I always need help fixing fences." He smiled for the first time. Within 2 weeks, 3 more veterans joined him. Then 6, then 12. Some worked with the dogs, others repaired barns. Some simply sat beneath the oak tree with a cup of coffee. No one was pressured to explain their pain. Sometimes healing begins when people finally stop asking questions. One Saturday afternoon, I watched Rex approach Chris. The young veteran had barely spoken since arriving. He mostly kept to himself. Rex walked over slowly, rested his gray muzzle on Chris's knee, and stayed there without moving. Chris stared at him. Then his hand slowly reached down to scratch behind Rex's ears. A few seconds later, he started crying. Not loudly, quietly, the kind of tears that had been waiting years for permission to fall. I turned away to give him privacy. Military dogs understand grief better than most people. They never ask you to explain it. They simply stay. As the sanctuary grew, neighbors who had once believed the rumors began showing up with donations. Feed, lumber, blankets, medical supplies. Mrs. Evelyn Parker arrived carrying homemade pies. "I owe you one." "You don't owe me anything." "I do." I judged before I knew the truth. I accepted the pie with a smile. "Then let's agree we're both moving forward." She hugged me. Sometimes forgiveness spreads farther than anger ever could. Late one afternoon, I noticed a familiar pickup truck parked quietly near the entrance. Daniel. He didn't drive onto the property. He simply stood beside the gate, watching volunteers repair fences, watching veterans laugh with the dogs, watching strangers protect the place he'd once tried to sell. I walked over. "You can come in." He hesitated. "I don't know if I deserve to." "That's not what I asked." Slowly he stepped through the gate. Rex looked up from the grass, walked over, and gently leaned against Daniel's leg. Daniel froze. "I don't deserve this." I smiled softly. "No." But Rex isn't keeping score. Daniel knelt beside him, tears filling his eyes as he wrapped his arms around the old dog. "I missed him." "You missed all of them." "I know." Then he looked around the sanctuary. The volunteers, the veterans, the restored barn, the laughter. Finally he whispered, "This is what Dad would have wanted." I nodded. Yes, it always was. For the first time since Michael's death, my son wasn't looking at the farm and seeing money. He was looking at it and finally seeing home. Winter arrived quietly in rural Georgia. The pecan trees stood bare against pale blue skies, And every morning, a thin layer of frost covered the pastures before the sun slowly warmed the fields again. The sanctuary had become part of my daily rhythm. Every sunrise began with feeding the dogs. Every afternoon brought new visitors, veterans, volunteers, families, and sometimes people who simply needed a peaceful place to sit without anyone asking difficult questions. Michael would have loved it, not because people were praising his name, because people were helping one another. That had always mattered more to him than recognition. 3 months after the sanctuary officially opened, Sheriff Robert Hayes stopped by again. This time, he wasn't wearing his uniform jacket. He carried a small cardboard box. I found something while cleaning out an old storage room at the sheriff's office. What is it? He handed me the box. Inside were faded photographs, training manuals, military newsletters, and one framed newspaper clipping. The headline made me laugh. Local soldier trains elite K-9 teams for overseas deployment. The photograph showed a much younger version of me standing proudly beside Rex's predecessor Ranger. I haven't seen this in years, I said. Hayes smiled. I figured it belonged here. I carefully carried the frame into the community room. It became the first photograph visitors saw when they entered. Not because it honored me, because it reminded everyone that service never truly ends. Sometimes it simply changes direction. The sanctuary continued to grow. Chris, the Marine veteran, who had barely spoken during his first week, eventually became one of our volunteer coordinators. One afternoon, he walked beside me while we repaired a fence. You know, I almost didn't come here. Why? I thought asking for help meant I'd failed. I smiled. I used to believe that too. What changed your mind? The Army taught me something. A soldier who refuses help during a mission doesn't become stronger. They become isolated. And isolation is dangerous. Chris nodded thoughtfully. These dogs understand that better than people. They do. They never judge. They just stay. One Saturday, we hosted our first Community Appreciation Day. Families brought homemade food. Children laughed as they watched demonstrations of basic obedience training. Veterans shared stories they had never told outside military circles. The atmosphere felt nothing like the painful afternoon when police cars had once lined my driveway. Standing near the barn, I caught myself looking toward the entrance. For just a moment, I imagined Michael leaning against the fence with his hands in his pockets, smiling that quiet smile I missed every day. I whispered softly, "We did it." The wind rustled through the oak branches as though answering. Later that afternoon, Rebecca Collins approached me carrying another envelope. "No legal documents this time," she said with a grin. "I'm relieved already." "It's from Daniel." I looked at the handwriting. I recognized it instantly. "I wasn't sure if you'd want to read it alone." "I think I should." After everyone left that evening, I sat on the porch and opened the letter. "Mom, I've started writing this letter a dozen times. Each version sounded like an excuse. You deserve honesty instead. For months, I convinced myself I was fixing problems. The truth is, I created them. Every decision I made pulled me farther away from the values you and Dad spent a lifetime teaching me. When I saw the sanctuary opening, when I watched veterans laughing with those dogs, I finally understood what I almost destroyed. I wasn't trying to sell land. I was trying to sell our family's story. And some things should never have a price. I don't expect things to return to the way they were. Maybe they never can. But if you ever need someone to repair a fence, or paint a barn, or carry feed, I'd like the chance to earn my place back, one day at a time. Love, Daniel. I folded the letter carefully. Not because everything had been repaired, but because for the first time, I believed healing had become possible. The following Monday, Daniel appeared just after sunrise. He wasn't carrying paperwork. He wasn't wearing expensive business clothes. He climbed out of an old pickup wearing worn jeans, work boots, and Michael's faded canvas jacket. I hadn't seen that jacket since the funeral. I found it in my closet, he said quietly. I forgot I still had it. I looked at the familiar patch sewn onto one sleeve. Michael's name. I smiled. It fits you. Daniel laughed nervously. Dad would have said it's still too big. He probably would have. So, he shifted awkwardly. What needs fixing? I pointed toward the north fence. About 300 yards of fencing. He looked at it. That's all? I raised an eyebrow. You were expecting an easier assignment. He smiled for the first time in months. No, ma'am. We spent the entire morning replacing broken fence posts. We didn't talk much. We didn't need to. Some conversations happened through shared work instead of shared words. Around noon, Rex wandered over and settled between us in the shade. Daniel scratched behind his ears. I missed this. I know. I kept thinking the dogs would hate me. They don't think like people. They judge what you do today, not who you were yesterday. Daniel nodded slowly. I wish people worked that way. I looked at him. Sometimes they can, but you have to give them a reason. As the sun began setting, volunteers headed home one by one. The farm grew quiet again. Daniel loaded tools into the truck before walking toward me. I'll come back next Saturday. You don't have to. I know. I want to. I studied his face. There was still regret, still sadness. But there was also something I hadn't seen in a very long time. Humility. Before leaving, he paused beneath the oak tree where Michael's ashes rested. He removed his cap, stood silently for nearly a minute, then whispered something I couldn't hear. He didn't need to tell me what it was. A son doesn't kneel beneath his father's tree unless he's finally ready to tell the truth to himself. As I watched him drive away, I realized something unexpected. I wasn't waiting for the son I had lost to come back anymore. He never could. Instead, a different man was slowly learning how to become someone his father would have been proud to know. And somehow, that was enough. Nearly a year passed from the afternoon. My own son stood beside a line of police officers and said the words that nearly destroyed us both. Take her away. For a long time, I thought those would be the last words I remembered from the darkest chapter of my life. I was wrong. Because life has a remarkable way of writing new endings when we have the courage to keep turning the page. Spring returned to the farm with fields of wildflowers stretching across the property Michael and I had spent decades caring for together. The pecan trees bloomed again. The old barn wore a fresh coat of red paint, thanks to dozens of volunteers. Children's laughter echoed across the pasture as veterans demonstrated simple obedience exercises with retired military dogs. The Thompson Veterans and K-9 Sanctuary was no longer just an idea. It had become a home, not only for the dogs, not only for veterans, for anyone carrying burdens they no longer wished to carry alone. Sometimes I stood on the porch just to watch strangers become friends. Watching healing happen quietly reminded me that hope rarely arrives with fanfare. More often, it arrives through ordinary people choosing kindness over fear. Daniel kept every promise he made, not once, not twice, week after week, month after month. He repaired fences, painted kennels, delivered hay, mowed fields. He never asked to be placed in charge. He never asked for recognition. He simply worked. The volunteers gradually accepted him, not because I asked them to, because they watched him earn their respect. One afternoon, Chris, the Marine veteran who had become our volunteer coordinator, walked over while Daniel was repairing a gate. I judged him pretty hard, Chris admitted. So did I replied honestly. But people can surprise us. Chris nodded, only if they're willing to change. Daniel overheard us. He didn't defend himself. He simply kept tightening the bolts on the gate. That told me more than any speech ever could. Ashley eventually came to the sanctuary as well. She looked nervous as she stepped out of her car carrying several boxes. I wasn't sure you'd want to see me. I wasn't sure either, I admitted. She looked down. I've had a long time to think. So have I. Without another word, she opened the boxes. Inside were blankets, dog food, medical supplies, leashes, cleaning equipment. I wanted to help. I looked at her for a moment before nodding. Then help? There were no dramatic hugs, no instant forgiveness, just work. Sometimes rebuilding trust begins with carrying supplies instead of making promises. Over the following months, Ashley volunteered quietly alongside everyone else. She cleaned kennels, prepared meals for veterans, organized fundraising events. She never once tried to explain away what had happened. She simply accepted responsibility through her actions. That mattered more than apologies. Late one afternoon, Rebecca Collins arrived with exciting news. "The state approved your nonprofit expansion grant?" I stared at her. "They did?" She laughed. "They certainly did. The sanctuary will be able to build additional kennels, therapy rooms, and housing for visiting veterans." I looked around the farm. The same property that greed had nearly destroyed was now creating opportunities for people I had never even met. Michael would have smiled. Actually, I think he already was. Several weeks later, Sheriff Robert Hayes called. "Grace, I've got a question." "I'm listening." "Would you mind if the department held its annual community appreciation ceremony at the sanctuary this year?" I smiled. "I'd be honored." "I was hoping you'd say that." The ceremony took place on a bright Saturday morning. American flags lined the entrance. Local families filled folding chairs beneath the oak trees. Veterans wore old service caps. Children chased each other across the grass, while the retired military dogs calmly greeted visitors with wagging tails. I stood near the stage, feeling overwhelmed. Not by sadness, by gratitude. Sheriff Hayes stepped to the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, a year ago, many of us stood on this very property for entirely different reasons." He paused. "Some of us arrived believing a complaint. Instead, we discovered courage, we discovered integrity, and we discovered that loyalty sometimes has four legs." The audience laughed warmly. Hayes continued, "Today we're here not because someone needed to be arrested, but because someone chose compassion over revenge." He looked toward me. "Mrs. Grace Thompson, would you please join me?" I walked slowly onto the stage. Rex Major Scout Daisy Bruno and Willow followed behind me without a single command. The crowd applauded as the 6 old military dogs sat perfectly beside me. Even after all these years, their discipline never faded. Neither did their loyalty. Sheriff Hayes handed me a small wooden plaque. It read, "For a lifetime of service leadership and unwavering loyalty to veterans, military, working dogs, and the community." I ran my fingers across Michael's name engraved beneath mine. He had been included, exactly as he deserved. The audience stood. Every single person, including Daniel, including Ashley. Neither of them clapped the loudest, but both of them cried. When the applause finally faded, Hayes leaned toward the microphone one last time. "I'd also like to recognize 6 very special veterans." He smiled at the dogs. One by one, each retired military dog received a ceremonial service ribbon, placed gently around its neck. Rex stood proudly despite his aging joints. Major wagged his tail. Daisy looked more interested in the children nearby than the applause. The crowd laughed again. For a moment, it felt like the entire world had become lighter. As the ceremony ended, Daniel quietly approached me beneath the old oak tree. "Mom." "Yes?" "I don't know if I'll ever deserve another chance." I looked toward the sanctuary. Veterans talking together, dogs resting peacefully in the shade, families smiling. "This place exists because your father believed people could become better." I turned back to him. "I still believe that." He wiped away a tear. "I won't waste it." "I know." For the first time in a very long while, I truly did. That evening, after everyone had gone home, I carried 2 cups of coffee onto the porch. Old habits die slowly. I placed one cup beside Michael's empty rocking chair. The sunset painted the fields in shades of gold and amber. Rex rested at my feet. The other dogs slept peacefully nearby. I looked across the land that had survived. Greed, betrayal, lies, and heartbreak. It wasn't untouched, neither was I. But we were still standing. And sometimes, standing is its own kind of victory. I smiled toward the fading light. You were right, Michael. Loyalty really does outlive everything else. A gentle breeze moved through the pecan trees. Some people would call it coincidence. After 45 years of loving the same man, I preferred to call it an answer. Because family isn't defined by the people who share your last name. It's defined by the people and sometimes the faithful dogs who refuse to leave your side when the whole world gives them a reason to walk away. That is the legacy Michael left me. That is the future I chose. And that is the story I'll carry for the rest of my life. If there's one lesson my journey taught me, it's this: never mistake kindness for weakness and never mistake patience for surrender. For a long time, I believed that loving my family meant trusting them without question. I thought giving people the benefit of the doubt was always the right thing to do. But I learned that true love must also include wisdom. Setting healthy boundaries doesn't make you selfish. It protects the life you've worked so hard to build. I also learned that greed rarely appears all at once. It grows quietly through small compromises, little lies and decisions people convince themselves are for the best. That's why honesty matters in the little things just as much as the big ones. Character isn't revealed during easy times. It's revealed when money, power, or opportunity test our hearts. Michael prepared for the future because he believed that truth should always have a way to survive. His careful planning didn't just protect a piece of land. It protected dignity, memories, and a lifetime of love. I'm grateful I listened to his wisdom, even if I didn't fully understand it until years later. Perhaps the greatest lesson came from 6 retired military dogs. They never cared about wealth, titles, or property. They recognized loyalty, consistency, and compassion. They reminded me that trust is earned through actions, not promises. And sometimes the strongest family we have is made up of those who choose to stand beside us when life becomes difficult. If my story touched your heart, I'd love to hear from you. What would you have done if your own child had stood beside the police and told them to take you away? Could you have forgiven them? Please share your thoughts in the comments. I read as many as I can because every story reminds us that none of us walks through life's hardships alone. And before you go, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. I truly enjoy seeing how this community reaches people across different countries and time zones. If you believe stories like this remind us of the importance of family integrity and hope, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and join me again for another heartfelt journey. Until next time, take care of the people who prove their love through their actions, and never underestimate the quiet strength of a loyal heart.